All right. Good afternoon, colleagues, friends, and participants. Thank you so much for joining us today for another exciting PNE Talanoa. My name is Ivan Diarra, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. So today we're very excited to be exploring the topic of environmental auditing and tourism development in the Pacific, and perhaps to share with you some of the exciting work that is ongoing between SPREP, SPTO, and some of our partners in this space. Today's webinar is also hosted through the Pacific Network for Environmental Assessment. So thank you so much for joining and being a part of this event. But before we go any further and unpack our agenda for the day, I would like to now pass it to my director, Director Jobe Davetanibalu, to start us off the right way, with a word of prayer and provide some brief background on why we're gathered here today. So the floor is yours, Ratu.
Hi, Pinaka ID, and greetings to you, Christine and Francesca. And also to you, my very good colleagues who are connected online this afternoon. Before I share a few words to start our Talanoa today, may I kindly ask that we bow our head and close our eyes and I'll offer a word of prayer. Let us pray. Dear Lord, our Heavenly Father, we are again so thankful, dear Lord, that we are able to come together in this space to come and share and learn from each other in this important topic of environmental auditing. We thank you for the opportunity that allows us to come and meet with each other. The facilitators, the presenters, and the audience who are listening in today, we ask for your blessings. And thank you for allowing us to come and fellowship together at this hour. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Greetings to you, colleagues. I, on behalf of the CEO of the South Pacific Tourism Organization and our colleagues, Christine and Francesca, and also the Director General of SPREP, I take this time to welcome you all. I noticed that I know some of the participants were joining in today very well, and I must thank them sincerely for continuing to show interest in the area of environmental assessment. Today's topic on environmental auditing is something that is commonly neglected in the area of environmental assessment. Why? Why the question why is because if you look into this tool, it is an important tool to assist us in our monitoring works out there in the various fields that we are responsible for. And the focus of this webinar today is that with the SPTO and SPREP through the ACP-MEA Phase 3 project, it was picked up that since the Pacific region is commonly known as a tourism place, and with the numerous infrastructure development that is taking place around our region, the establishment of this tool is vital to allow regulators, operators, people who visit tourism organization to know what are they contributing to in terms of safeguarding our environment. So through this initiative, thanks again to the ACP-MEA 3 for its support financially to support this work that we are doing. And while we have Christine and Francesca here on board, the team would like to learn too from you on how we can develop, how we can put together a good environmental auditing guideline that will be useful to our governments in terms of achieving the goal of a sustainable Pacific tourism. So I know I don't want to take much of the time of the presenters, and I'm looking forward to that from Christine and Francesca. And not forgetting, I'm also looking forward to the guidance and questions and advice that will be shared by you, our participants who are joining online. So with those few words, Mr. ID, good luck in the moderation of the meeting today, and it'll be an exciting one, and will be led by you. Thank you, and Vinagapolyo.
Director, and thank you for setting the scene for our discussions today. But before we introduce our speakers for today, let me just share some brief sort of housekeeping rules for our webinar today. One, as you all notice, this session is being recorded, and we hope to have a recorded version on the PNEA later on for those who may have missed the session or who may not be able to stay throughout the meeting. But of course, we encourage you to sit in and listen to the exciting discussion that Christine and Francesca will be sharing with us today. If you have any comments, please drop your comments in the chat, and we'll be revisiting those later on during our Q&A session. Please also keep your mics muted just to avoid any background noise. If you do need to make any interventions, just raise your hands and we'll try to give you the floor. And I think that's all our housekeeping rules for today. So to introduce our speakers today, I'm very excited to first introduce Ms. Christine Keane. Christine is the Managing Director for Environment Pacific. She has a wealth of experience in environmental and risk management practices and has been pivotal in assisting businesses, governments, and communities in strengthening their environmental and social governance. Her multifaceted background encompasses governance, risk auditing, government tourism strategy development, and renewable energy advisory roles across Australia, New Zealand, and of course, the Pacific. Secondly, we also have Ms. Francesca Mills, who is an environmental scientist with GHD. Francesca's role is a fascinating blend of climate change science, environmental and social impact assessments, and air quality management. So we're very excited to have these two wonderful ladies joining us today. And with that brief, and I hope just introduction, I'll pass it on to Christine and Francesca.
Perfect, thank you for that, Ivan. Kia ora and welcome to our presentation. If you could please share the slides, Ivan. So our presentation is an introduction to environmental auditing as part of the SPREP and SPTO auditing guidelines for tourism operations in the Pacific project. As I am based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I will begin with a karakia, which is on the next slide. Tūtaua mai I ranga, tūtaua mai I raro, tūtaua mai I roto, tūtaua mai I waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora ki te katoa. Haumie, huie, tai kia. There on the right of the screen is the English translation. So come forth from above, below, within, and from the environment. Vitality and well-being for all strengthened in unity. So to begin the presentation, on the next slide, I would like to acknowledge that some businesses or some participants in this call will undertake regular auditing and others won't. And we recognise that there is a mixed audience within our attendees, and we're very grateful for all of you to join us today. You may be coming from different backgrounds and different familiarities of the auditing process, and we're wanting to run you through what we believe is a good introduction to environmental auditing. The first thing that I want to point out is the importance and possible benefits from environmental auditing. The biggest one, I guess, is the benefit for the people. Those are both locals and tourists, all the people that live on the country and work in the country and play in the country. And the ongoing effects for the wider environment, such as the trees and the animals. And in a sum, environmental auditing is good for the local economy. It's increasingly being noticed that tourists are looking for environmental stewardship where they travel. And we acknowledge that there is a lot of tourism in the Pacific countries. Some countries are already taking this stewardship to the next level with active tourism surveying in country. But it's important to really recognise these benefits of good auditing practices. I will now pass over to Kristen Keane. She is a lead auditor in environmental management systems, safety management systems, and quality management systems, and she will talk further about environmental auditing. Kristen, you're on mute.
How's that? Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Francesca, for the introduction there. Ivan, if you could move to the next slide, please. So environmental stewardship is a good, powerful word there that Francesca, or term that Francesca was using, and auditing can certainly help to achieve that. So as has been mentioned, the objective of the presentation today is to run through the process of auditing. And as Francesca made mention of, some of you may be really familiar with auditing, and some of you, it may be a new process. So the objective really today is provide some background on auditing, the types of details you'll be looking for, and the sort of tools you'll be needing to use. So I guess to start with, like so many aspects of our work life, the history of many of the words that we use comes from a Latin meaning, and this came, the word audit came from adire, which is Latin for hear, and I think that that's quite prevalent in appreciating that auditing is really about listening and observing to details to be able to then make an informed decision and assessment in terms of what it is that you're auditing. So I guess just keep that in mind as we move through the slides. So we will be looking at what is an objective for an audit, the key processes as you're stepping through an audit, the resources needed, and also opportunities for different tools and education and training. So the case studies that will be used during this particular presentation, it is focused on hotel accommodation. And that's because the focus industry for the development of the regional environmental auditing guidelines for the tourism operations in the Pacific, which is the initiative that we're meeting about today with SPREP and SPTO, is focusing on hotel accommodation. So while I'll be making reference to hotel accommodation predominantly, there might be other examples because we've had a look through some of the responses from the questionnaires that have come through, and appreciate that auditing to you may not necessarily be just tourism based, but the principles of auditing that we run through today can be applied to various aspects of, you know, the auditing procedure and what activities you're working with. Could I have the next slide, please, Ivan? So the layout of the presentation today is essentially how an audit can assist to improve environmental management. Francesca did touch on this during the introduction, but, you know, of course, depending on what you're auditing, there could also be products that come out of it in terms of recommendations around safety as well. Could be governance. There's a bit of a linkage there in terms of environmental management and crossovers with other areas that you're looking at. So we'll talk through those as we go through as well. The audit process. So as I mentioned, the objective and the design. So when you're when you're going to do an audit, you know, you've got a plan for it. You know, there might be specific guidelines or policies or legislation that you may want to refer to or base your audit around. People, key. If the key people are important to have in the room or involved in the audit. And then, of course, we'll go through the resourcing, interviews, record keeping, and, you know, the outcome, a couple of examples of outcomes that you hope to achieve from the options. So again, training and education, another biggie, and of course the tools. So we'll run through that in terms of what may or may not work for you. So environmental social governance is definitely an increasing focus for a lot of organisations. And I appreciate that organisations can change from a family-run business up to, say, a chain of hotels run by, you know, run internationally and globally, which have much more complex structures, much more, you know, greater management structure, greater governance structure. So we hope to be able to talk through auditing processes that can apply across all these types of structures in organisations. So they can help to improve environment, safety, social and governance at the end of the day. And for example, environmental management systems, if any of you are auditing those, essentially, you know, you might be looking at documentation that's been put together to comply with ISO 14001. It could be about compliance with permits. For example, if you're a regulator, are you going to site to essentially, you know, do an audit of that permit against what's actually happening on the site? As a tourism operator, you may be wanting to achieve best practice whenever you can. You know, it might be that you're doing an identifying point sources of pollution, for example, in an effort to try to minimise your impacts to the environment. Audits, again, have the opportunity to identify things like training and record keeping. Next slide, please, Ivan. So, as I've mentioned a couple of times, really defining that it's worth the time upfront, really investing that time in developing an accurate objective for your audit. That way, the auditor knows exactly what it is that the organisation wants to achieve. If you're working for a regulatory agency and it's all about compliance, say, for example, the auditee has a permit and you're the regulator. So the objective of that audit might be, for example, running through every condition in the permit and for the purpose of meeting the audit, which is basically to see how compliant that activity is or that permit holder is with that permit. So that is one example. And we've got down in the bottom left just an illustration of that example. So, for example, if you are a regulator, you might be using particular government policy. You might be, like I mentioned, using a permit, or you might be relying on a regional or international guideline, for example. You know, the requirement for the audit might be different. Sure, it might be compliant. So a compliance audit. So what? So what's the compliant audit for? Is it necessarily because you want to see if they're compliant for a permit? Yes, it could be. And then could it be that that permit you need to demonstrate compliant because it might have something to do with a larger or as a component of a larger thing. For example, if there was a funding opportunity through, say, IFC or the World Bank, quite often the status of things like biodiversity and social safeguards and all that sort of thing are taken into consideration, which might be the underlying driver for the audit. The internal audits to the right, that might be something that, for example, the tourism operator might want to do, as I referred to earlier. I probably don't need to go into too more details on that, as I mentioned it earlier, but just to see, it might be about improving, their own environmental practices. It could also be in preparation for an audit, because perhaps they know that the regulators are coming and they just want to make sure that they're on top of, the activity and their compliance status at the time. So it's definitely worth an investment of time, making sure upfront that the objective is known, and especially by both parties. So this slide really starts, I guess, the phase around planning and delivery. Planning is significant, because obviously you need to program it when you, I guess, key people, for example, are available. So it's good to have a program set out from the very start in terms of how you do want to deliver it, what your thoughts are around how you want to communicate with people, whether it's around interviews. So if we just start from that top dot point, which is around documents and guidelines, it's very worthwhile, if you are referring back to guidelines, to make sure that you're pulling out the relevant sections that you need to be able to audit against on the site, whether it's a permit, for example, whether it's provincial government guideline, whatever it might be that you are auditing. So it's understanding what the criteria is that you need to sort of pull out of any of those documents, or any subordinate documents related to those. Risk management, that is good to be mindful of risk. Obviously, with a hotel accommodation facility, depending how many resources it has, there will be certain activities that will potentially be higher risk than others. For example, if you had sewage treatment plant or even sewage wastewater generally, that would probably be in the higher risk category, as opposed to some sort of inert storage area on, whether it's the island or, associated with the hotel accommodation. So it's a risk management approach. If any of you are familiar with it in your day-to-day sort of activities, it's a really good way of going about and trying to prioritise those activities in terms of what really needs your focus as an auditor during the audit process. It's really about understanding, if there was an incident, say, for example, sewage treatment. Say you had a sewage treatment plant with an outfall out to the ocean, and there was a risk, say, for some issue with the plant, and then there was an E. coli exceedance. What is the likelihood of that happening? And if you have great operators and really good, daily plant checks and a really good program in place, water quality monitoring or whatever it might be, there's a number of controls in place that identify really how likely that event could be. And then you would look at it, say it's very unlikely, but it's a really significant consequence. Say there's always people swimming around that area or catching their fish for dinner or whatever it might be. It's working out the likelihood and the consequence of that, whether it would be, a low, medium, high or very high consequence. So it's a good practice to keep the risk management approach when planning an audit. People and resource requirements. So when you're doing an audit, you'll have background documents that you're using. Whoever is being audited will often supply documents at your request. So it's useful to plan for that. What sort of documentation and resources do you need from organisation you're auditing. And also the people. There's key people that will be able to provide the responses in regards to your audit. So it might be the operator, for example, if we keep on with the sewage treatment plant, that can tell you about the sort of controls or monitoring they may do. Or it could be, you know, somebody that's working in utilities that might be in charge of how hazardous goods are stored on the property. It could be the general manager of a hotel, or it could be I guess a supervisor overseeing particular activities. So identifying the right people to have involved in the audit's a key part of it. So when I make mention of interviews, ultimately an interview is a discussion at the end of the day. So feel free to change that word to discussion. Interview sounds really formal. And at the end of the day, I think it's quite a significant thing for an auditor to also help people feel relaxed to a degree during the audit, because at the end of the day, those people are providing you with information. And I know, and still I have clients I've been auditing for 10 years now, and especially if they've got new people, they're a little bit like, oh my gosh, it's an auditor, you know. So I think the idea really from my experience is really to, obviously, you know, if you're a regulator, there are key things that you're trying to find out. And it's about trying to establish that relationship with whoever's being audited or the key person, you know, you're discussing this with. So it's something to be mindful of in terms of, establishing that relationship with them. A good idea is having checklists and a template ready to go for your audit. That way, and they may be elements of those things that you can actually provide to people before the audit starts. That way they're prepared, because if you want to see all their water quality data, and it might be in the bottom of a filing cabinet, you know, at the back of a 10-hectare site that's not really that easily accessible, and you know, it's the middle of a monsoon and you can't just drive there because half the site's flooded. So it's worth having some aspects provided in advance, because then it gives people opportunity to gather that data for you. Record keeping requirements, similar again, as an auditor, you probably want to you're going to want to see evidence of you know, the activities and how they're being managed on the site, and particularly if we're talking about a compliance audit. And I think language is quite an important one too when it comes to an audit. For example, and you know, you would want to be quantifying or qualifying any statements in the audit, you know, probably avoiding words like, you know, this particular activity, you know, it was pretty good how they were doing X, Y, and Z. You could probably quantify that by, I went through, you know, the water quality monitoring was all compliant with the permit. I mean, that speaks, you know, that speaks a lot in its own right. So if you can qualify and quantify when you're auditing, especially in your reporting, it really helps to make the audit more robust in that regard. So could I have the next slide, please, Ivan? The audit itself, normally, you know, especially in terms of environmental, will accommodate site work as well as office work. The site work will generally include a site, whether it's a walkover, a drive over. There might be areas that you can't access for whatever reason. Could be the weather, could be the fact that it might be spread over a large area. And there's tools that might apply to this that I'll talk about a little bit later. But at the end of the day, you know, the field work and the office work component are both critical in most circumstances when it comes to assessing compliance. So at the end of this, a debrief will happen or is recommended to occur where the key people and the auditor is in the room. At that point, you can discuss as an auditor what it is that you've seen or observed during the audit, any information gaps. The key people in the room might be able to close out some of those information gaps. And then there will be a confirmation and discussion around the final stages of the program in terms of closing out that audit report. So in terms of what the audit outcome looks like, I mean, for regulators, there may be an existing template that's used. And similarly for tourist operators, for your internal audits or whatever it might be, there may be a template used as well. I'd recommend that it would be good practice to include, you know, the name of the auditor, all the details of the activity, you know, the date, the time, what the weather was doing, those sorts of details. Qualify the experience of the auditor. And I can't really emphasize enough that look at your current experience, because that a lot of that is probably already including assessment of different things. You may not have thought of it as coming under the guise of auditing, but for example, like Francesca does a lot of work on air emissions, and so evaluations on air, and you know, the principles behind the assessment and auditing, you know, it's quite similar, because you're looking for well, compliance, non-compliance, where there might be an improvement opportunity and recommendations for the client. Similarly, when I've been doing biodiversity or social safeguard work, you know, that's been driven by the requirement for, you know, the funding, the donor bodies to do that. But, and again, it might be ecology based, or it might be about engagement with the community, but there's a lot of principles that cross over. So do look at the history. I mean, you might be a dedicated auditor, but in the same breath, if you're not, but you still do a lot of assessment work, you'll probably see a lot of similarities anyway between that and the auditing outcomes. So in terms of when you're putting your reporting together, experience that you can see a connection with is relevant to include. So we've got 2 case studies now. One is really for the regulators, and then one is for the tourism operators. So there's just, these pictures are really just to illustrate a few instances where audits might be relevant. Say, for example, the first one might be a non-compliance of an activity because it should have particular permit requirement. The second one is an audit of impacts for water quality. So obviously you can see in there, you know, there's people swimming basically. So the regulators might be interested in the water quality objectives and any discharge that might be coming off a tourist accommodation site as well. Here, I mean, it's a pit toilet, this one, but you know, essentially wastewater sources is fairly common across all the countries in the Pacific when it comes to regulations. Some countries have a lot more regulations than others, but generally even the ones with less regulations, wastewater sources seem to be a key feature for, you know, in terms of legislation. And the next one, so this is, you know, accommodation facilities. The photos are from all different areas. The first one was a accommodation that I was staying in PNG last year. So essentially, you know, that photo is just to illustrate that there's quite an interest across the Pacific, and not just the Pacific, but globally really, in terms of sustainability. So the internal audit might be about energy consumption. It could be about goods and products consumption within the particular accommodation there. Francesca actually collected this photo. So this was actually waste disposal. It was actually for a landfill assessment that Francesca was doing. And that was Vanuatu, wasn't it? Yes. So waste disposal is a big one. There's been a few, accommodation facilities and not just like short-term hospital, but short-term holiday accommodation, but longer-term accommodation, where quite often, we've observed that, rubbish is either buried, it might be burnt, because obviously if you're restricted with resources, there's not the barge coming over to collect it like some of the other, resorts which may have, more resources to and commercially can afford to do that sort of thing. So, you might be looking at an audit around that, how you can improve your waste management, reduce your pollution, reduce burning off, ties in a little bit with recycling and reuse where possible. And again, general housekeeping. So that's another thing that's quite common in internal audits as well. I mean, I have one client that I've been going and doing a third party for them, but it's got nothing to do with the regulators. It's just for them to know how compliant they are with their permits. Are we doing it like any new activities? Are we doing anything new? Does that require a permit? Is there a best practice measure that you can recommend that we implement for that? So it is a good proactive tool to use. So out of all of this too, the auditing is really great for identifying if there's any shortage in training and education. So there's a couple of shots here. One at the bottom, essentially you can do technical training. This one's illustrating safety because, ultimately safety is relevant to aspects of environment too, whether it's chemical and, hazardous chemical fuel storage and handling, that sort of thing. So by all means, I guess the resourcing financially can be restrictive. And if that's the case and employees are unable to necessarily have training, if you have really good supervisors and mentors on the ground, and even networking across the industry can be really terrific too. So, it's about having the opportunities for staff, whether it's in a regulatory organisation, whether it's part of an accommodation facility, to have that on the ground training. Right, so this one is about audit tools, and some of these are quite fancy and then some of them are actually quite fun. Again, it comes down to, how much resourcing your organisation has. I know there's been a few times where I've used drones because I haven't been able to access certain areas. I've had to go and audit erosion and sediment control for wind farms. And if any of you have had anything to do with wind farms, they're expansive, some of them, and they're several hectares. And, to drive from one end to the other, it can take a really long time. And sometimes the conditions aren't great. And again, it's happened, for example, I was doing a wind farm down in Tasmania, which is south of Australia. And it was actually a regulatory requirement because it was too wet and they really needed to up their erosion sediment control. So the drones are great, but again, you need people that are trained to use them. There might also be regulatory restrictions in terms of using drones as well, and licensing requirements. And the rest of the photos are really to illustrate what sort of electronic options there are. So for example, there's different GIS systems you can use, so you can see where you are at the site, and you can potentially, if files are available, overlay them so you can use those when you're actually out in the site, and keep notes on there about what your observations are, take photos and tie them into the GIS. So there's a lot of great software out there. Similarly, down the bottom, it's quite common for auditors to use electronic spreadsheets to make notes, observations, and connect photos. The thing is with auditing tools, though, is that if you're out the highlands or, on a lovely beach looking at a hotel accommodation in Samoa or wherever you might be, there is a chance of not having any internet. So at the end of the day, using paper and a pen is completely okay. That's my preferred option when I have the opportunity to do that. That way you can take a lot of notes. I guess in terms of recording, if you were thinking of recording, that would require permission, or it's recommended to require permission from anyone involved in that audit, because not everyone would want to be recorded. And the other thing would be understanding any sort of language or cultural considerations also that you need to take into mind in terms of the auditing. Could I have the next slide, please, 11? So in summary, and I hope you found it useful in terms of the process, essentially the audit objective and the key people, they're big ticket items in terms of emphasising that for your design and planning for your audit. Essentially, the tools, the auditing template checklist, the program, and then, of course, as we mentioned, the outputs in regards to any reports or, you know, completing templates that you may have for that auditing process. You can include recommendations if you think it's suitable for the audit that you're doing, because quite often it might not be that, you know, organisations are not wanting to comply or not wanting to do best practice. They may just not be aware how to achieve it. So something else to keep in mind anyway when you're auditing. So that's me in terms of the auditing process. Feel free at any point to put things in the chat. It might not be something that we can address today, but we can certainly have a look at those in consideration for finalising the development of the guidelines. And any feedback you have is going to be really gratefully accepted, because it's really going to give us some insight into the types of issues that you deal with that may not have been considered in this auditing guideline. So it'll be really helpful for us to be able to address that. So I'll hand over to Francesca now, who's going to give you an update in terms of where the environmental auditing guidelines are at.
Thank you, Kristen. Currently, so to provide this update, as Joppe and Ivan said earlier in the call, we are developing environmental auditing guidelines. So to this point, we've undertaken a lit review and we're currently in the consultation phase. That you may have seen recently that a questionnaire was sent out to regulators and tourism operators, and we're currently doing the workshop. And our next phase will be to develop the good practice guidelines. And as Kristen mentioned, we'd really like your comments or questions or anything about those guidelines. Over the next few slides, I will update you on just a few of the findings that we got from the questionnaire. And the results from the questionnaire was so interesting, but we unfortunately don't have time to share all of them. But we received results from 40 regulators over 12 different countries throughout the Pacific, and 24 operators from over three countries. So one of the findings from this was that we identified that from a regulator's perspective, there is a large number of businesses which may not be able to achieve compliance. And these included smaller businesses, businesses that may be in more remote areas that are hard to reach, or areas that have limited infrastructure, technology, or just businesses that may not have that environmental knowledge or awareness of any tools and trainings that are available. So businesses that lack resources is a kind of summary of the red and orange boxes. So that's a large proportion of businesses that could have improved ability to respond to auditing. So we can see in these two figures that both regulators and operators are either not aware or do not believe that they have that operators have sufficient resources to perform appropriate environmental management for compliance. These are very interesting results, and we're hoping that this the questionnaire results and the ongoing guidelines will help to respond to these queries, or just requirement for these guidelines. And then on to the third slide. We see that regulators have also identified that in general, a lot of businesses perform well. However, the areas where they need improvement are in the process, the awareness, and just given support to develop these. And this will be assisted through the development of this good practice guideline and your opinions here today and any comments and questions that you have. I'll now close this with a closing karakia, which is on the next slide, and then we can go into your questions. Kia whakaarea te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, humie, uie, taikie. And that translates to restrictions are moved aside, so the pathways are clear to return to everyday activities. Thank you, and I'll pass on to Ivan.
Thank you so much, Christine and Francesca, for that enlightening discussion that we just had. Really interesting, and there's so many points and exciting sort of key items that you shared with us today, and I'm really happy to sort of be blessed with the knowledge that you shared with us today. But like we also mentioned in the introduction, colleagues, today's session on environmental auditing is also an opportunity to really hear from you as well, our stakeholders, on what you want to see in the guidelines, perhaps the issues you face, whether you are a regulator or from the operator side. What are some of the key issues that perhaps you would like to share with us, as well as Christine and Francesca? And how do those things affect your work, and how can we perhaps improve your work processes? Like Christine mentioned, checklists and other toolkits are very beneficial. So, is this something you would like to see included in the guidelines? So just to hear from you and your thoughts, and because we're going into the Q&A session now, so I'd like to invite any of you to perhaps raise a hand and ask any questions. You can also drop your questions in the chat, and we'll be happy to pass it on to Christine and Francesca. So please, any comments? I think to start off, I see Director Chope has dropped one suggestion in the chat bar, and that is to perhaps in the future include a flow chart of the process, and that's the process for the development of the guidelines. Thank you for that suggestion, Director.
If I may, Ivan, if I may.
Go ahead, Director.
It's not the process for the guideline, it's the process for the auditing process, undertaking the auditing. So,
okay.
If I may, while I have the floor, Christine raised something about social safeguards and auditing. The relationship between social safeguards and auditing is a very, very important area that needs to, the linkages, the importance of environmental auditing in the area of local safeguards. Why I'm raising this, Christine? This is a new thing that is currently under discussion. It's been a talk of partners in terms of strengthening, raising capacity in the area of environment assessment for environmental regulators. And that's number two. And number three, Mr. Moderator, I really like what Francesca raised about most of the business operators are not complying. They don't have the resources to comply. But the question to ask, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And I think that will be a question that can be answered by our colleagues who are listening in today. Why is this happening? Is it to do with enforcement capacities? And there are many other things. I just raised that as an example. But as you've said, Mr. Moderator, it will be good to hear from our participants who are connected in today. Thank you for giving me the floor, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Director, and thank you for those suggestions. Yes, indeed, I think achieving compliance is sometimes, a challenge. And like Francesca mentioned, it depends on also the size and the scale of the operation. A lot of the operators, for example, do not get opportunities for trainings and sort of capacity building and so on. So there's also issues on that end. But it's really good to hear from participants joining us today about what are the issues they see in their own sort of day-to-day roles. And
yeah, absolutely. And the reason being is, well, in part, because we'd like to make sure that we adequately address that as well within the guidelines so that they're applicable across the Pacific, because obviously there will be site-specific and regulatory-specific, I guess, issues for one country that may not necessarily affect the other. So we're trying to make the guidelines as applicable as possible to everybody. Ultimately, the principles of auditing remains the same in terms of the process, but it is certainly worthwhile for us to be able to take into consideration any specific aspects that you've come across, or any case or any examples that you've come across that we can, keep in mind before we address that appropriately in the guidelines.
Thank you, Christine. There's just some comments coming in here in the chat. First, we have a comment from Maleta, and he says, can the presentation be shared after this meeting? And yes, participants, we will be sharing a copy of the presentation as well as a record of the session today. So stay tuned for that. We also have quite a long comment/question from my colleague Anastasia. And she says, thank you for this informative presentation. Would the guidelines provide some guidance to address overlapping functions of a regulator to audit? Small administrations often have to discharge multiple functions, and often the regulator as the state agency and at the same time a tourism operator to support smaller businesses as tourism operator has to audit the tourism development. Or is this an internal arrangement decided internally? Not sure if you caught that, Christine.
Yeah, I'm just reading that at the moment, actually, and make sure I understand the last section of that. So the small administrations often have to discharge multiple functions. at the same time, and then a tourism operator to support smaller businesses has to audit a tourism development. So is that, Anastasia, is that question, if you're happy to let me know, about really resource constraints in terms of, availability of people within the organisation to do that audit?
Thank you, Christine. Anastasia, if you don't mind, you're welcome to take the floor and please share your question.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you to the presenters, Christine. My question really is about the small administrations here having to juggle many regulatory functions, as you've stated. And one of those things that you've alluded to and mentioned is the resources and how they can effectively carry out an audit, and at the same time, government as well is also a tourism operator, developer, because simply because the governments are the largest stakeholders in a country, especially for small islands. So in those situations, would the guidelines offer some guidance as to how small countries can address those? So I'm thinking maybe have clearer mandates. Would that be a guide to small administrations so that auditing is carried out effectively and without any blurred lines? So
yeah, so it has that increased, the transparency about it. Yeah, that's right. So the guidelines will look to doing that. So there will be a checklist included or a template in the back that can be used as a basis for the audit. So that will certainly be something that can be kept in mind. There's also opportunity there to, if it was about trying to demonstrate some real transparency, Anastasia, in terms of, okay, they're the developer, but they're also auditing themselves, which I suppose we've come across with a few different clients for different reasons, whether it might be, different governments also completing their own activity. There's also an opportunity, to engage third-party auditors to be able to do that on behalf of the government if there were the resources. But if you're relying on people internally, and the checklists that are being provided in this do hope to be able to assist you in those terms of the maintaining transparency around those internal audit procedures. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kristen. I think you've basically provided that guidance that I was looking for. To guide our national authorities on the options that they have, that they could either outsource or engage third parties and things. So thanks for that.
Yeah. You're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you, Anastasia, and thank you, Christine, for the excellent response. I think we have another question here from Viliame Omoivalu, and he asked, most operators are not complying because of one, that there is no relationship or healthy relationship built between tourist operators and the approving authorities. I think Viliame here is contributing to the discussion on why perhaps compliance can be an issue in the industry. And as Viliame points, I think having that relationship and that network with the approving authorities can also be a stumbling block.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I appreciate that, Viliami. It is it's a bit of an evolution, I think, with the legislation and the processes for regulators. Considering it's only the last few decades, really, that the different environment legislations have really been developing quite strongly. Yeah, the guidelines certainly that we're in the process of developing will certainly be acknowledging that as a constraint. Could I ask which country you're based in, Viliami? I missed that at the beginning. Even if you put it in the chat, if you didn't want to speak to it.
Christian, I'm from Fiji.
Ah, Fiji, right, okay. Sure. Right. Well, yeah, the guidelines certainly will address it as a constraint, but yeah, I agree with you. It's definitely a relationship building exercise, and not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to be that one-on-one, but it's also tied in very closely with education and training. I don't know what sort of opportunities exist for you currently in your position with regards to sort of, you know, establishing or contributing to that relationship building, but there's certainly opportunities that will be included in that guideline. Does that provide an adequate response to your note in the comment? I certainly appreciate what you're saying on that. Yep, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I also see a thumbs up from Viliami, so thank you. And I also see a hand from Director Jope. Ratu, the floor is yours.
Thanks to Viliami for raising that question, and I want to reverse the question back to him. He raised about that relationship, and we'll appreciate him sharing with Christine and the team on how we can improve on that relationship. But that is my contribution to Viliami. But my question, Christine, is on standards. And you shared with us your work on auditing outside the Pacific region. And one thing that is lacking big time here in the Pacific region, and most of our member countries, is standards, environmental standards. So take that matter. Maybe if there's standards for tourism, maybe yes, tourism standards also. But in the guideline, I would strongly suggest that, to make reference to some standards that you come across and being useful when you undertake auditing of tourism outside the Pacific region, because this is something that when we share this guideline, of course, it gives them some reference, some ideas. Okay, these are the standards which we can use to apply when we are doing our own auditing within the Pacific or within the countries that we are based in. So it's just a suggestion, but again, I would like to raise the matter of standards as something which is of an issue in the region. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Jope. Yeah, agree with that. And that's the approach we are using during the development of that, because some of the guidelines, the regional and international ones, are quite high level. So how do they apply to you as a country, or how do they apply to you in a province? So was there something you were adding to that, Jope, or your hand was up? Was that from before?
No, it's from before.
Okay, sure. All right. Yeah, certainly. So there will be a range of standards and guidelines that will be included in there that can be considered in terms of trying to, with the aim of making it more, what's the word I'm looking for? Suitable for the activity or the organisation that you're auditing, essentially.
Now, don't see a question yet, but I just wanted to ask Christine this question. I understand that the guidelines are tailored specifically for the tourism sector, but can it be applied to other sectors as well, particularly with regards to the checklist and the other tools that you'll be developing? Can those be applicable in other sectors or areas, or will those only be suitable for to audit tourism operations and activities?
Yeah, there'll be elements of it that are applicable generally. So the principles of auditing themselves can be applied across the scale. And that's where it comes back to the importance of working out what your objective is right at the very, very start. But the actual process associated with auditing is really similar across the board. You know, whether you're looking at safety, whether you're looking at, you know, organizational processes from governance to operational or whatever it might be. So there are going to be quite a few aspects of it that can be applied across. In terms of the checklist, I mean, the checklist is being developed for hotel accommodation because it'll be considering the activities that are typically found in hotel accommodation. There might be an opportunity for people who use the guideline to adapt the checklist to something. Like they might say, oh, okay, that part of the checklist is about conditions under a permit or something or other. Well, I can adapt that for my mining resources or quarry extraction client or something. And if they can sort of see those principles through the checklist. So there will be opportunities like that. But I guess overall, specifically, it is aiming, you know, in terms of the hotel accommodation, but certainly there's aspects of it that can be referenced and used for other activities.
Thank you, Christine. That's very clear. Again, colleagues, I think we have one more comment here in the chat, and that's from Petero from Kiribati. And I think Petero is asking for a copy of Christine's presentation. And yes, Petero, we will be sharing a copy of the slides as well as the recording from today's session with participants. But I see Petero has his hand up, so please, Petero, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly. I do apologize. We've had bad internet here in Kiribati today, so I was out most of the call. But I'm just picking up on the last part of the conversation here with regards to the standards. And I would like to pose the question if this is something that can be incorporated, or what are your thoughts of incorporating it into national standards that are based on a number of criteria. For example, here in Kiribati, we have what's called the Maorimak. And under the Maorimak, it's a rating system for accommodation providers, and they're rated across different criteria, and sustainability is one of them. And I wanted to just get your take on that, Christine, in terms of incorporating, you know, standards, recommended standards into assessment criteria for accommodation operators. Is it something that you've since been done in other destinations that you've worked with, or have they always been kept separate?
It's a very good point there in terms of those existing criteria. I'm just wondering, listening to you talk, there might be, well, I guess, yeah, firstly, there's probably a way we can tabulate things like that, or, you know, a key criteria like that are available for countries that can be referenced as part of the guidelines, so that each, you know, wherever you may be in the Pacific, you can use it as a reference to see whether there are automatically any criteria or standards that are relevant to what you're looking at. Yeah, I guess in terms of my experiences with tourism, you know, in the Pacific, a lot of it has been driven by well, very different requirements. And I have to say quite a bit of it's been around almost like a due diligence for donor funding opportunities, whether it's, you know, MFAT or DFAT, providing funds to upgrade an airport, or, you know, for developing hydropower or things like that. So the objective of the audits have been quite variable, but certainly we've been doing more in the space of sustainability and that sort of aspect, which is certainly bringing to the forefront sort of the more of the criterias around that too. So I suspect, and that's a really good question, that we can incorporate that into the guideline by tabulating those relevant criteria and standards that are available into a tabulated format, probably as an appendix, I'd imagine, in that auditing guidelines. So whoever uses it can pick it up and just see what is relevant to their particular country.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that? Did I capture what you were raising there, or is there anything additional you'd like to add in regards to that?
No, that's all. I mean, I have a few questions, but I'm not sure whether it's related to your presentation, because I wasn't present in most of them. So perhaps I'll go through the presentation and the recording, and I'll probably get in touch with you for further clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Petero. And just very quickly, Petero, you're also invited to join our Pacific Network for Environmental Assessment. And through there, you can have access to Christine and other practitioners in the space, and you can connect and keep this conversation going. I'll be sure to send it in. I'll send a link to you. I also see my director has his hand up, so I'll pass it to Director Jope. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and Petero Bula Binaka. Thank you for your question. And yes, you raise a very important point about existing criteria. Some of our member countries already have existing criteria or standards, but I also know there are a few lawyers listening in this conversation that we are having. When you talk about environmental auditing, sometimes this can be argued around the outcome of the auditing, can be argued in the court of law. And I think in my view, it is important that whatever standards or criteria that we are basing our assessment on are governed and endorsed within the government policy processes. So that is my contribution to the good point you raised. And like for now, we are working with the Solomon Island to deal with the liquid waste standards. And the draft is there. And it will be taken through the government endorsement process for it to be annexed in the environment management. So again, it will be challenging for this case for the Solomon Island, because different industries has different economic power, so that they can put in a proper mitigation mechanism to allow meeting the standards that the government will agree on. But again, thank you so much for that question. And I totally support Christine. If even having those criteria examples annexed, or even the provision of the leak of those criteria from government, will be really appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Binaka, Director, and thank you for the excellent discussions. I don't see any further comments or questions in the chat, and I also note the time here. It's 3:22 here in Apia, so perhaps I'll say this should be it for our webinar session today. But before I pass it on to my director to close off for today, I'd like to just pass it on to Christine and Francesca to share any final words on today's session. Over to you, Christine.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for inviting us to come along and join you and present, and the opportunity to contribute to the development of the guidelines. And I really appreciate everyone that attended today, and your feedback is relevant and valuable for the documentation that we're putting together. So please feel free, if you have any comments that you think of after the workshop. I'm assuming Ivan can, we connect through you, or however best you'd like to do that, in terms of us being able to provide a response if anything's needed, and for us to consider during development of the guidelines. And Francesca.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for hosting Ivan and Jope. It's been great to be able to share these insights with you and to gain insights back from you all that attended today. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca and Christine. I have to say this was quite exciting. I'm glad, we did a webinar rather than a traditional sort of stakeholder consultation. And I'm quite certain that the discussions that we had today will be very useful in terms of guiding how we develop these guidelines. So I'd like to thank you both, Christina and Francesca, and also thank our participants for joining us today and for the excellent contributions. But to bid us bye today, I'll pass it on to my director, Ratu Jope. Over to you, Ratu.
I need not say anything else. You sum it up well, and but thanks to Christine and Francesca, and most importantly, to our participants who joined us this afternoon. And Heidi, is it possible to take a screenshot of all of us? Do you know the function to manage that?
Yes, thank you for that suggestion, Ratu. Yes.
Yes, please.
We'll just encourage everybody to put on their screens if possible. Let's just take a screenshot.
Especially Bill from Fiji. I want to see Bill's face.
Look at everybody. That's lovely.
We'll throw